Thank you and good afternoon, folks. Before I begin, I'd very much like to thank Bob Hitchcock, Catherine DeVries, and Dr. Price for inviting me to this conference. It has really been a pleasure to be here with you folks over the last couple of days, and it's actually got me working on a newer hypothesis, and my thought being for you folks as surgeons, if you've got any degree of access to engineering students, then you might have a pool of people there that can address technological deficits that you're seeing when you're out abroad on these global projects. So I want you to engage you guys now and at the end of this talk to start thinking about, how can I fill these deficits that I'm seeing via the use of this great engineering population that I'm guessing is available to many of you. So my talk is going to have some common themes to what Bob has presented, what Kathleen presented, and what Paul presented, but I'm hoping there are enough differences within there that it'll keep you guys engaged. Otherwise, we're just going to reiterate a lot of different points, so we'll really drive this stuff home to you. So I'm going to be talking about what we've been doing in our own senior design program with regards to global health technologies. And what you'll find is that our program is not quite as mature as what Kathleen has laid out, but I want to lay out a bit of a narrative for how we got involved in these sorts of things and how you as surgeons might be able to become more engaged with senior design programs at your own institutions. So as a bit of an overview, senior design in Columbia, much like it is at Utah, is a 2-semester course sequence. In the first semester, our students are primarily focused on problem definition, laying out design criteria for their designs, as well as developing business models for how they will go about turning a profit from these devices, how they're going to go about manufacturing, distribution, etc. We also have them look into what regulatory pathways their designs will need to follow as they go along with this development process. So the first semester is primarily the inputs to design, figuring out what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. We do not mandate that students work on any particular projects, nor do we provide a listing typically. We count on our students to call on their own experiences, anecdotal evidence, things that they've done in research laboratories, any sort of clinical internships, for them to identify their projects. And what we find a lot more often than not is that this gives the students a great sense of ownership over what they're doing, much better than what happens if you were to force a particular project on a group of students or if you just offer a pool there. So some of the things we've done over the last 5 or 6 years or so, we've developed helmets for monitoring hypothermia in athletes. We've come up with a laparoscopic surgical assist tool to prevent bowel perforation. Visual guidance tools. We've also come up with assist devices for children afflicted with spinal muscle atrophy. And within the last couple of years, with the advent of tablet-based devices and training tools, our students have been developing apps that can be used by students afflicted with autism, children afflicted with autism, or children that have recently received cochlear implants as training tools. So what we have found over the last 3 or 4 years is that we've been becoming more and more interested in global health technologies, and for a lot of the same reasons that Kathleen just pointed out in her last talk, principally being that in these low resource settings, we're talking about parts of Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Central and South America, there are surgical and medical technologies there, but oftentimes these technologies have been donated. That is, they weren't specifically designed or developed for use in these settings. Therefore, when these devices fail, no one's there to repair them, there's not the infrastructure there to actually understand what's going on, or there might not necessarily be the knowledge in the first place to even utilize the devices. And this is really sad because what often occurs is that the maladies that afflict children, women, adults, this whole spectrum of patients are probably pretty treatable using technologies that are already existing here in the United States. So what you see more and more and what you've gotten a small glimpse of today are these advent of multidisciplinary programs targeted towards addressing these technology deficits. So you see programs in different stages of development. Some of them are very mature and doing a great job. I think specifically of Rice University, University of Michigan, Duke University, and their Engineering World Health. So there are plenty of programs that are doing this sort of things. And like I said before, what I want to walk you guys through today is what we've been doing to kind of get ourselves into this arena of developing global health technologies. So just to give you a bit of background, what we were originally doing was, in the past 4 years or so, prior to my arrival at Columbia, students were getting interested in working on these global health technologies. They were coming to the instructors of the course, myself and Professor Elizabeth Hillman, and saying they wanted to work on these sorts of devices. the problem that was encountered in those early iterations was that the students did not have a specific customer nor a specific place to which they could visit to identify their design needs. So what was often happening is what I like to call a moving goalpost syndrome. That is, as they would be developing their designs, and if they came upon something that they didn't have a clear understanding of or something that could not be defined in the literature, they would be changing their design criteria based on what they knew and what they did not know. So it was only in the spring, summer of 2010 when we became introduced to physicians in the Department of Neonatology at Columbia, as well as to a neonatologist in Uganda, that we were able to really lay out our explicit global health technologies program. So we met a Dr. Margaret Nakakato out of Uganda, and what she did is she posed to us these specific technology deficits that she often encountered in the neonatal care unit in Uganda. And working in coordination with her, we were able to start to lay out the foundation of what our program would be. So this is critically important. We had an explicit customer with well-defined needs that we could use to drive our device development. So, like any major endeavor, you look at both sides of the argument. What's the benefit to my constituents, that is my students, as well as what's the benefit to the potential users of these devices? What we thought would be most beneficial to our students is that this gets them engaged in thinking about engineering using a different set of paradigms than what's done for development in first world countries. So while the process is essentially the same, the specifications and constraints that go into their designs are drastically different. So from the start, our students have to be concerned about what is the knowledge base of the people with whom we're working, how much money is available to purchase these devices, what's the effect of the surrounding environment, are they going to be in some place that's going to be extremely dirty? All of these sorts of things come into play very early on and are present throughout the entire design cycle. This also engages our students thinking about these problems from a socio-economical standpoint as well as cultural issues. That is, it's not as simple as saying we're just going to develop these devices, put them out there, and expect people to utilize them. You have to be aware of the culture into which you're deploying these devices, as Professor Wiesner touched upon quite extensively yesterday. Also, it got our students thinking more and more about the regulatory issues that accompany device design. So we often have our students look into FDA requirements, ISO standards, and what we found pretty early on as we were in these initial talks with the physicians in Uganda is that such standards are not in place. So it pretty much requires us to hold ourselves to a particular standard. That is, saying that our devices should be able to live up to ISO and FDA standards before we seriously consider deploying anything in Uganda. And finally, and perhaps most meaningful for our students, is developing devices that will have some tangible impact. So what Bob and Kathleen and what myself will tell you is that as senior design professors, what often happens is that these projects are fairly evanescent. Students work their tails off for a year or so, they come up with a nice prototype, they graduate, and then they're pretty much gone. Nothing really happens to a lot of these devices beyond that. Sure, some students go on to form startup companies, but for the most part, you know, it's much safer to go to graduate school or medical school or take that great paying job right out of college than to take the risk of starting up a company. So what we established pretty early on is that what we were going to do with these projects was not to simply have them go through a cycle of senior design, but actually have the prototypes be the framework for continual projects that would be tested and hopefully deployed in Uganda. And what we found fairly early on was that this really excited our student population. So looking at the other side of the equation, how could a collaboration with BME be beneficial to the people in Uganda? Our thought was this would give them access to a rising core of biomedical engineers. That is, we've got a very smart, very clever group of students that would be specifically working on designs that would be utilized in Uganda. Again, addressing that deficit that occurs with the use of modern technologies. Any prototypes that arose from this design process would be specific for their use. So pretty much custom medical instrumentation based on our students' efforts. And another kind of offshoot that has come from our discussions with Mulago Hospital in Uganda and Makerere University is the idea of sharing best practices in engineering, specifically in biomedical engineering curriculum design with the university. They're actually in the early stages of developing their own bioengineering program, and I've had the opportunity to actually provide some input into what they're doing. The thought being the engineers that are trained in Uganda will ultimately have to be the people that not only maintain these devices, but at some point take responsibility for the device needs within their country and be the people that are designing and implementing solutions in country. So no longer relying on donations from outside of Uganda or the work of outside engineers, but actually developing their own cohort of engineers that can build up these technologies. So we started doing our homework on Uganda. That is, we had this initial introduction, and we wanted to figure out, is this the right place for us to start working? And it became clear fairly early on that there was a very explicit need there. So Uganda is perhaps one of the worst countries in terms of maternal and neonatal health in the world. It's amongst the top 50 in neonatal mortality with 38 deaths per 1,000 live births. The annual per capita expenditure on medical health is about $14 in Uganda. And in terms of their overall health, they ranked 186 out of 191 nations in 2006, according to the WHO. Additionally, what we find is that many of these neonatal mortalities that occur are occurring during the neonate or perinatal period. That is, 30% of these babies die within their first 4 weeks of life, oftentimes to preventable maladies. So as we started looking around some more, we wanted to see what the technological deficits were between Uganda and what's commonly done within the United States. And this led us to start juxtaposing what you would see in a neonatal intensive care unit in the US compared to what's in Uganda. So what you see here is just a fairly generic NICU. I believe we took this at CUMC in their Department of Neonatology. And pretty much each baby that's in a unit like this has its own hospital suite. You've got plenty of isolates there with redundant monitoring systems for heart rate, respiratory rate, body temperature, and typically what you're looking at is a nurse to infant ratio of, say, 2 to 1 or even 1 to 1 in many circumstances. So when we compare and contrast this to the conditions at Mulago Hospital in Kampala, Uganda, which is the major hospital in the country, we see a drastic difference in conditions. So this is a picture taken in the special care baby unit in Uganda. You can see that there are many of these old, kind of creaky looking bassinets. The floor is dirty. There are some isolates there that look like they were probably donated incubators. And what often happens in those cases is that those incubators are not functioning. They're basically functioning as glorified cribs. So it's taking up space, it's bulky, it's not being utilized. So all of these sorts of things said, okay, we got to do this. We can fill these deficits. We can help these people out with regards to their design needs. So what we started doing was we had this explicit customer in Dr. Nakakato over in Uganda, and we engaged in a series of conference calls with her during the summer of 2010. And through these calls, we were able to establish for ourselves, that is myself and Professor Elizabeth Hillman, what device needs would be appropriate in the scope of senior design and what our students could probably develop into useful prototypes. So again, we didn't want to do anything that would not be a significant design experience to our students. We're still academicians. We still have the burden to train our students in this engineering process. So we vetted the projects to a certain extent, but we still came up with a pretty comprehensive listing of things that our students could embark upon. So here's a listing of our initial set of projects. Again, I'm sure what you see here is pretty common in what Kathleen has seen abroad or what many of you guys have seen in your own studies at different countries. We were charged with developing a modular incubator for district hospitals. Again, there are incubator chassis there, but they're not functioning. O2 room air entrainment systems. So oftentimes what we found in Uganda was that there were sources of pure oxygen, but obviously you cannot expose a neonate to pure oxygen for extended periods. So they needed ways to mix this with air in controllable proportions. Basic monitoring systems for quantifying heart rate, respiratory rate, or measurement of body temperature. Low-cost phototherapy systems for treatment of jaundice. And finally, minimally invasive systems for quantifying bilirubin levels or small volume infusion pumps, small volume retraction pumps, things like that were what we were initially charged with this first cycle. So with these project ideas in mind, what we did is that we basically, during the start of our senior design course in the fall of 2010, we had our students begin with their initial problem definition and need statement and identification phases of their projects. But in coordination with students working on conventional projects, we presented this pool of potential ideas and the needs in Uganda. So, as I said earlier, usually we have our students define the projects for themselves. However, in this particular circumstance, we found that it was more appropriate to give them some idea and a bit of a push in terms of what things they could be working on. So what we found, and what was very exciting and encouraging to us, is that without prompting, again, we don't force our students to do any projects, that half of our student design teams within that first semester elected to go and embark on these projects. So we had 4 of our 8 student design teams in 2010, 2011, working on low-cost medical technologies for use in improving neonatal outcomes in Uganda. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about 3 of the prototypes that came out of what we did during that 2010, 2011, and discuss some of the things that worked, that didn't work, and give you some basic feedback on what we've seen here. So one of the things we learned very early on in our discussion with the physicians in Uganda was that oftentimes what you find is that babies, while they receive some degree of prenatal care, oftentimes are not born in a hospital circumstance. 70% of people in Uganda live in rural settings, so commensurately, 70 to 80% of all births take place in these rural settings. What can occur is that if something goes wrong in that early perinatal period, the baby becomes feverish, whatever might occur, that baby would need to be transferred to a higher level district hospital, oftentimes via bicycle, on foot. If the baby and the caregiver are lucky, they'll be in a car or a van. So you're traveling along these tenuous Ugandan roads that are unpaved over large distances. The average trip from an outlying district hospital to a higher level hospital is about 90 to 120 minutes. So what can happen during that period is that whatever was afflicting the baby before becomes exacerbated by hypothermia. Again, these are new babies. They can't necessarily regulate their own body temperature. So what we are charged with doing was developing a system that could enable caregivers to transfer these babies in a fairly mechanically stable system, as well as provide some degree of warming during the transport to combat this hypothermia that occurred. So our design team, called Bundled Up, developed a fairly simple but elegant neonatal transport unit. So for those of you that are familiar with the folks at Stanford and what they did with the Embrace unit, there are some similarities here, but this is our own spin on that design. So what this unit consists of is basically an insulating and latent heating bassinet that has multiple forms and functions. So it's comprised of an insulating layer as well as several polyurethane layers to provide baby comfort during transport. It can be carried in several different configurations as shown here. One configuration is kind of like what you would do with a car seat for short-term transport. Our second configuration here is a face-to-face setup so that the caregiver can be carrying the baby while monitoring them, that is, looking at the baby, making sure that he or she is breathing, that they're not becoming cyanotic or anything like that. And our third configuration consists of a wraparound unit so that we can maintain the standard of care that's often suggested in Uganda, that is kangaroo care. So using that wraparound system, you could say that the carrying subject might be shirtless, the baby would have this direct contact with the caregiver's chest to provide some heating. In addition to the heating and the insulation provided by the carrier, there is a small pocket along the backboard of this unit into which a packet of delta phase material can be placed. So for those of you that aren't familiar, delta phase material is pretty much like paraffin wax. What happens is that as you heat it up to around 37 degrees Celsius, it will maintain that 37 degrees Celsius even with the additional application of thermal energy. So it's kind of like a thermal buffer. It gets up to 37 degrees and plateaus even with increased administration of energy. As it reaches that activation point, it goes from a solid to a liquid phase and remains liquid for an extended period. The energy that it dissipates going back from a liquid to a solid phase is enough to keep a subject warm for an extended period of time. So using that delta phase, we were able to keep our inert biofluid model warm for up to 120 minutes within our transport unit. So our thought is, using this system, even without the kangaroo care, it would provide sufficient latent heating, safe latent heating, to keep this baby warm during transport from a rural setting to a higher level hospital. And we found that the total cost for the system was around $50 per unit for these initial prototypes. The next problem that we were presented with that our students took on was the idea of treating jaundice using low-cost phototherapy. So I'm sure many of you are familiar. Jaundice is a result of immature livers leading to a buildup of bilirubin within a baby's blood. On its own, this is typically not terribly harmful. It leads to baby skin yellowing, happens very commonly even here in the United States. However, we can treat it fairly easily with blue light phototherapy, or often a mother and father are told to just take your baby home, leave the windows open, keep them warm at night, and eventually things will equilibrate. However, in places like Uganda, where there's not sufficient warming via incubators, as well as the lack of phototherapy units, what can often happen is that jaundice can progress into hyperbilirubinemia. That is the buildup of these bilirubin products in the blood, eventually leading to brain damage, deafness, blindness, or even death. So this lack of a fairly simple technology can lead to lifelong disabilities within these babies. So what we found in Uganda was that there were some phototherapy units, again, things that had been donated. Typical phototherapy units cost between, say, $2,500 to as much as $10,000. And they're often comprised of blue incandescent lights, fluorescent lights, or LEDs. So functionally, it's not a terribly complicated design. Therefore, our students were able to take away all of the non-essential elements of these to come up with a fairly simple, fairly elegant blue light phototherapy system. So what we've got here is an array of Optec high-power LEDs. Each one of these LEDs costs 45 cents. And we were able to put those into this array of a printed circuit board and into an ABS plastic that's simply powered by a laptop adapter. So a very simple system using some components that could be found in country. And what we found is that using these low-cost, high-power LEDs at distances as low as, say, 8 centimeters from the baby, we could achieve the threshold levels for bilirubin breakdown during phototherapy. Something that's novel about the system that we've designed is that in addition to providing over-body phototherapy, we also propose that this system can be used for under-body phototherapy as well, which can be useful in Uganda because, again, there are deficits with regards to how to keep your babies warm. So using the underbody configuration, our thought is we put this unit down into a bassinet or a crib, put the baby on top of the unit, and you can place blankets over the baby while they're receiving a significant amount of phototherapy without having to have them naked and exposed as they would be in the underbody configuration. Our third and probably most technically challenging design problem with this first iteration of our global health technologies was the development of non-invasive vital signs monitoring. So what typically happens in Uganda, which is quite different from what we see in the United States, is that there's often a significant dearth of personnel to attend to babies in a neonatal intensive care unit. The number that we were quoted was typically on the order of 25 babies to one nurse. So what can happen is that if something is going wrong, that is if a baby is becoming apneic, if it's getting bradycardic, if it's becoming hypothermic, a nurse might be in a corner of a room and not have any knowledge about what's going on at some distal location compared to where she's located. And by the time she reaches the baby, whatever is wrong has progressed into a serious event. Now, what we saw when we were in Uganda is that there are some monitors, but again, these monitors donated by Massimo and places like that can cost upwards of $10,000, obviously not realizable for accounting for every baby within this unit. So what our students were charged with doing was developing a system that could basically continually monitor an infant's vital signs and provide alarms in the instance of some abnormal event with regards to heart rate, respiratory rate, or body temperature. And our students actually came up with a very, very clever way of going about doing this. What they did is that they used polyvinyldiene fluoride, which is a piezoelectric film. When I say piezoelectric, I mean something that its electrical field changes in response to pressure. They embedded this piezoelectric film into a soft foam mat onto which the baby would be placed. So what happens is that with the deformations that occur during inspiration and expiration, as well as via cardiac contractions, those deformations are transmitted to this mat and deform the PVDF such that it generates an electrical signal corresponding to the breathing rate and the heart rate. So what you see here is their mat prototype, and in these figures to the right are voltage readings from a strain gauge that was wrapped around a subject's chest, as well as the PVDF sensor that was embedded in that mat. And you can see the upward and downward deflections corresponding to the subject's breathing as verified by the strain gauge. Similarly, we measured the subject's electrocardiogram and monitored the electrical signal coming off of the PVDF, and it's a little tricky to see. If you want to talk to me later on, we can look a bit more closer. But what you'll see are the small voltage fluctuations corresponding to each cardiac contraction. So what they came up with was this fairly non-invasive way to monitor respiration and heart rate, and then using a thermoelectric probe, they could monitor a baby's temperature as well. So this entire system feeds its electrical signals into a central unit, which contains the requisite analog filtering and microprocessing to take these electrical signals, analyze them, and produce rates such that a nurse that's walking around a ward can simply take a quick look and say, this baby is breathing at such and such a rate, at this heart rate, and is at this temperature, as well as we include in our system alarms that would go off in the event of some abnormal reading. So this system, compared to what you would normally see from a commercial monitoring system, costs around $185 in terms of its components. It's quite expensive for Uganda, but much cheaper than a few $1,000s for a conventional monitor. So at the end of this first year of our project developments, we had a set of very satisfactory prototypes, these three that I've just mentioned. So as I said before, we didn't want these things to just go away. So what I was able to do is I was able to recruit a group of our students that had done these projects to basically work pro bono. They stuck around after graduation and helped me out in terms of the continued refinement. And what we did is we took our initial prototypes to Uganda in July of last year. This was primarily a fact-finding trip. That is, we were going over there to get our first experience looking around at the conditions in Mulago Hospital, as well as in the surrounding districts, getting feedback from our potential users on our devices, as well as identifying potential new designs or new device needs that we could bring back to our students for continued development. And what we were able to find is that our devices were very well received. We learned quite a bit more about the conditions than we knew before, and it's helped us quite a bit in terms of moving forward. So as many of you have already learned or have pointed out during the course of this session, you can't really do this stuff without putting boots on the ground, right? You have to go, and in our case, we were subject to this tourist syndrome, but our hope is that as we move further and further along in the development of this program, that we have more extensive trips to Uganda. So here is a bit of a flow chart of how I propose that our program will work out. It's pretty much the same cycle as what I've discussed during the course of this talk. During the summer, we'll have students immersed in Uganda, finding new projects. They'll bring those back in the fall, go through their development process, and based on their outcomes, our hope would be that we'd be taking these back to Uganda for use. So, what are we doing now and what's next? Because of the successful outcomes of our first set of protocols and prototypes and how well they've been received, we continue with their development. We've actually received funding from the NCAA for continued development of our vital signs monitor, as well as the Department of Neonatology at Columbia continues to sponsor the development of our transport unit and our phototherapy system. So I was able to hire on a research assistant who was one of my students from last year, who continues to work with me on these designs. From our trip to Uganda, we've identified a new cohort of projects on which our students are currently working, including a transillumination device for vein identification. So that's what you're seeing here. It's kind of a proof of concept showing that with this skin dermal model with melanated skin that we can illuminate an underlying vein. So that's what that group is working on for this year. And we're also working to develop our business model. So I'll talk a bit more about that in the subsequent slides. So just to give a bit of an overview from our process and some of the growing pains that we've experienced along the way, I'd just like to share what I believe works, what doesn't work, and my suggestions for how people can go about implementing this in their own system. So a big thing is borrowing ideas. There are plenty of people that have laid the framework for this sort of stuff. I've talked to the people at Rice, I've talked to the people at Duke. Kathleen's probably going to be sick of me by the end of today because I'm going to talk to her plenty and find out what's worked for her. But borrowing ideas works out very well for these sorts of projects. There's no use learning painfully from things that other people have already done. Having a well-defined customer, that is knowing explicitly what country or even what region of that country you'll be working in, is imperative. The infrastructure in Uganda is probably not the same as what's in Ghana. You've got to know what's going on there. Therefore, you've got to be getting feedback both from clinicians in the United States who can identify the differences between these countries and the US, as well as continual feedback from the people with whom you work. So the age we live in is great in terms of we can use Skype, teleconferencing, and things like that to continuously get this sort of feedback. And finally, last but not least, I have a great set of students. So I've got people that work hard, that are interested in developing these technologies for use in Uganda, and that ultimately want to benefit their fellow man. So that's imperative, and what I think you'll see for a lot of you as you work with engineers that are at this level, you'll find the same thing. That these guys want to work hard, they want to do this stuff, that they are the people for this job. Don't underestimate what a group of senior engineers can do. What doesn't work? The sustainable model thing plagues us all. Anybody that is working on these sorts of projects, I've yet to hear anyone that has a magic bullet that can be used to continue with the development of their projects beyond the scope of a single cycle, and more importantly, come up with a method to keep their business afloat, come up with distribution channels, figure out how they're going to manufacture their devices. In fact, it was interesting looking at Bob's slides. Before I even met Bob, myself and the student I'm working with developed basically that same business model at a conference last summer. So it's encouraging to see that hopefully great minds think alike, but it's also showing that we still don't really have a clear idea of how we're going to go about doing this. So we need input from entrepreneurs, from business people, as well as our own way of learning how we can do these sorts of things. I don't think it's going to come from us being the sole manufacturers and maintainers of these devices. We're going to eventually have to pass these off to some local champion in Uganda. Going part and parcel with that is that you cannot depend on philanthropy to keep these efforts going. There's got to be some source of funding or income that will keep your devices sustainable. I mean, for a certain amount of time, people can keep you afloat, but you're going to reach a kind of a tipping point where you actually have to embark upon this as if you were an actual business. Assuming that your technologies will be accepted. So while we were in Uganda, we met plenty of very pleasant folks who were quite receptive to our technologies, who had nothing but praise for what we're doing. But the more and more I think about it, I think that just might have been their natural disposition. So this goes along with what Professor Wiesner was talking about yesterday, where you actually have to demonstrate the efficacy of your technologies. That if you've got to sell this to these people. You've got to show that this stripped down version of a phototherapy unit that my students have created will be better for you than this big clunker that was donated from Germany that might break in a few months and that you'll never be able to use again. And finally, working alone. That is, I think there needs to be a really strong collaborative effort both between each institution and their customers and country, but perhaps more importantly, amongst ourselves here in the United States. I mean, this isn't like hunting around for the same research dollars. We're all working towards essentially the same goal. So it would be quite beneficial to all parties involved if we were talking more amongst ourselves, keeping track of what different groups are doing and helping each other out, not only to contribute to our overall outcomes, but to continue to perpetuate this process. That is, rather than have these things be one-off, have different groups working in tandem or in coordination on these sorts of problems. So I'd be remiss without acknowledging a bunch of different people that helped out in this sort of thing. Dr. Richard Poland, who is our primary funder at this point. All of my students from the 2010-2011 academic year, as well as the current academic year, Dr. Nakakato in the Ministry of Health, the people at McCarry University, health volunteers overseas, and the NCAA, who has partially funded our work. I thank you all very much. I look forward to talking to you further about these sorts of efforts, and I hope you enjoy the remainder of this conference. Thank you.